Welcome back to the nervous system. New tie, new week, obviously. But I'm going to continue on with what I started last time. I was beginning to get into the function of the nervous system. So I talked a little bit about some of the neurotransmitters, some of the processes and disease states that they're involved in. Now I'm going to focus a little more on sort of the nuts and bolts of some real basic behaviors and basic regulation of movement. So we'll start with what are thought to be the simplest components of the nervous system in terms of behavior, and these are going to be the reflexes. So first we'll start by defining a reflex. It's going to be an involuntary response to a stimulus. So this is key, involuntary. Now some reflexes we have the ability to modulate using your brain. Others we don't. So the patellar, the knee-jerk reflex, we're all familiar with this. Right? The doctor takes his rubber mallet, gives you a light tap on that patellar tendon, that causes your leg to jerk. Now if the doctor, PA, nurse, buddy, whomever is banging your knee does it right, you have no chance of modulating that. You can't help it. You can't prevent it. When we talk about the neurobiology, we'll see. There's other reflexes where if you were to put your hand on a hot stove, what would happen? Don't try that at home, right? This is an intellectual exercise. You put your hand on a hot stove, ooh, you withdraw it right away. Right? And often that happens before you have even perceived that it's hot. So this is going to be, again, an example of a reflex. It's involuntary. One thing that's interesting about that withdrawal reflex, though, is that we can modulate it. We've all done this. You pick up a cup of coffee. It's a little too hot, right? You've got it in your hand. You don't know it's too hot at first. But as you're holding it, it feels like it's getting hotter and hotter. It starts to burn more, right? You walk faster and faster and faster so you can set it down. That reflex, though, is still trying to get you to drop it. It's still trying to get you to withdraw. But why don't you drop that hot cup of coffee? Because your cortex is saying, don't do that. Don't drop it. So your brain can inhibit this motor output. Okay, so some reflexes we can modulate a little bit. Okay. Others we can't at all. And we'll talk a little bit about the neurobiological difference between those two types of arcs in a second. I just used the word reflex arc. So what is a reflex arc? This is the neural path that the information is going to follow. And there's two types of information. We're going to have sensory information. Okay. Sensory information is going into the nervous system. That makes it afferent information. Now once we get there, hey, this is hot, I need to move away. I'm going to send motor information from the spinal motor neurons to the muscles that are going to cause me to move. Those are efferent neurons. Right? So afferent is going to bring information to the central nervous system. Efferent is going to take it away. You need to know that. And I learned, again, most of the mnemonic devices you are going to use to memorize things like your cranial nerves, I can't give you in these video lectures. I like my job, and I'm not willing to say some of those things on tape. They're filthy, but you remember them. Okay, so again, you do your own Google search, and you're going to find all kinds of interesting mnemonics to remember these things. Med students are great at coming up with mnemonics. Use their work, use their legwork. Okay, so again, with the mnemonics for cranial nerves, the one I know starts O, and I'm going to leave it at that. Again, filthy, but you remember it, and it's going to help you. We'll start with one of those. Here, I just learned when we're talking about this, you just need to remember same. Sensory afferent, motor efferent. They're the same. Fairly straightforward, fairly easy. Okay, so sensory information is going to be carried to the CNS. efferent is going to go from the CNS. I'm going to use those words a lot. It'll be expected in future courses. You know what afferent and efferent means. Those words afferent and efferent are used in many other contexts also. So those are good biology words for you to know. Afferent means toward, efferent means from. All right. So the basic components of a reflex arc first involve sensory receptors. So I've got thermal receptors in my skin. So when I put my hand on a hot plate, for example, I know it's hot. Okay, I can sense that. Things like UV light. When we go out, why don't we sense that? You can sense the results later, right, when we get a nasty burn, but you're not sensing the UV itself. What you're sensing is going to have to do with damage associated with it, the result of it. Right, so the UV light isn't detected itself. We have no idea. Some of the consequences, right, heat, for example, we can detect that. So in order to respond to any stimulus, we need sensory receptors that can respond to it. Right? So when we're talking about many, not all, but many of our reflex, we're going to talk about those sensory receptors in the skin. So we did talk about the somatosensory system briefly. We talked about all the different types of receptors, where they are in the skin, the type of information that they carry. But it's the sensory receptor itself that's going to transduce an external stimulus into an electrical signal, an action potential that's going to go to my central nervous system. My brain then, when it gets that information, is going to interpret that. Okay? So one thing, when we talk about sensation, there's two steps. We talk about detection, right? And that's just going to be this sensory response. And then we talk about perception. This is going to involve the brain. Sensory perception involves consciousness. Again, if you don't perceive it, that doesn't mean you didn't detect it. Now, if you don't detect it, obviously you can't perceive it. Okay. All right. Now, the sensory receptors, remember, that's going to be like a Pacinian corpuscle. Right? That's a small little structure, or outer segment of a photoreceptor where the photopigment is. Okay, that's going to be the receptor. Now, these need to be linked to neurons or part of neurons in order for us to generate that electrical signal. So that sensory or afferent neuron is going to send, not the stimulus. Remember, it's not literally sending the stimulus. When you detect touch, pressure information, pressure doesn't get transmitted to your nervous system, right? That's stupid. What does get moved, though, are action potentials. Okay? So these afferent neurons, again, are going to transduce this sensory stimulus into action potentials. Okay, so sensory receptors take a stimulus and then convert it into electrical signals, electrical potentials. These electrical signals are then going to get converted into action potentials. And that action potential then is going to be sent from this sensory afferent neuron into the central nervous system. Now, for most reflexes, we're going to have an interneuron. Okay? So an interneuron is a neuron in between two neurons. You could have figured that out all by yourself. It's going to be in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Now, one thing, we draw very simplified circuits. When I draw one sensory neuron carrying information, that doesn't happen in reality. I'm going to have hundreds and thousands of axons represented by that one. When I have one interneuron, again, we don't just have one interneuron. We can have many different interneurons. And remember, when the axon comes in, it branches. Okay, so one axon can actually make many, many different synapses. It can make synapses on different neurons. You remember this from the motor unit, right? Where I can get branching and I can have one motor neuron controlling hundreds of muscle fibers. Same thing. Okay, my sensory neuron can come and it can branch. Now these inner neurons, some of them are going to carry information up to the brain. Again, if it doesn't make it to my brain, I don't perceive it. We know this from patients who've suffered spinal cord injury, for example. Okay. They're also going to, though, go from join those sensory neurons and the motor neurons. Okay. So just remember, when we say inner neuron, an inner neuron can do many different things. Now, I mentioned that those already. They're in the central nervous system, and here they connect to motor neurons. Now I'm adding something to this. They don't just connect to motor neurons. These can also carry information up to the brain. The job of these inner neurons is to help process the stimulus, right? And this is vague. Really what we mean is it's going to give us an opportunity to either increase or decrease stimulation of that motor neuron. Okay, so again, I'm holding that hot cup of coffee. My inner neuron is going to actually decrease activity so that I have either inhibition or less excitation of that motor neuron so I don't drop my coffee. It's interesting too that central nervous system can modify this. So you're sitting around, I tell you, okay, pay attention here for a second. I'm going to take this book and I'm going to slam it on the table and see how much you jump. So I slam the book, you're going to jump. Okay, you can't help it. Again, that's going to be a reflex for the most part. Now, if you watch a scary movie and now I do the same thing, you're going to jump much higher. So the central nervous system, your emotional state, your psychology actually can affect these reflexes. And one important principle, your brain spends an incredible amount of time and energy inhibiting reflexes. So all these reflexes are in your spinal cord. They're between sensory receptors and motor neurons. Your body, again, is spending a tremendous amount of time inhibiting those. And I'll talk about one of these in a second. All right, so I got my sensory neuron. You know what that does. My inner neuron, or my association neuron, right, that's going to allow me to sort of modulate how strong that connection is between the sensory and the motor neuron. It's going to give my brain an opportunity to put its input in there, and it's also going to give me an opportunity to send some information to my brain. All right. Now the efferent, or the motor neurons, are going to send electrical signals to the effector. The effector, in terms of movement, is going to be something like a muscle. However, we know that the effector can be other things. It can be glands, it can be organs. I don't think we'll get the opportunity to talk about vagal stimulation too much. Right? But the vagus nerve basically innervates all your guts. And that acts as quite an effector. It's not on skeletal muscle, obviously, it's on things like your intestines. We'll talk a little bit about that later, I hope. Okay, so when we put this together in a diagram, this is a great diagram for you to know. I'm going to have my sensory receptor. And again, this is a general diagram. It doesn't matter whether this is pressure, thermal, pain. The basic neural circuitry is going to be the same. And I'm not going to break it down. I'm not going to, I didn't ask you to memorize all the different sensory receptors. There were a couple, like free nerve ending, being nociceptors, right? I wanted you to know that. But in terms of Pacinian, corpuscle, Ruffini, blah, 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 that don't worry about. But just know we have different sensory receptors to detect different qualities about the world around us. That information is going to get carried into the central nervous system by a sensory afferent neuron. Now you already can tell me a bit about that sensory afferent neuron. That sensory afferent neuron is going to be a unipolar neuron. That was one of the ones I asked you to remember. It's really the only example you need to know for this course. So we're going to have these sensory neurons living in clusters. Those clusters, those groups of cells in the periphery are ganglia. One ganglion, several ganglia. So the sensory neurons reside in ganglia. Now, these are unipolar. Okay, so they've got one process coming off. And essentially, we'll get the generation of an action potential near the sensory receptors, and that's going to be carried all the way down the axon into the spinal cord. Now, once we're in the spinal cord, we're going to make a synapse, a connection with an interneuron. That interneuron is going to make a connection with that motor neuron. Okay, so if we're talking about the patellar reflex, all right, I'm not going to go into the detail of what it is, but we detect a stimulus. That information gets carried down this axon to this interneuron. I'm going to have an excitatory signal that's going to make an action potential in this interneuron. When I get to this synapse, now we've got chemical communication, right? That's going to excite this motor neuron. Here at the axon hillock, again, I'll get generation of an action potential. That's going to go all the way down this axon to the muscle. Now again, this could be a very short distance or it could be a very long distance. Again, if you're tall, it could be a meter. All right. Now, once the action potential gets here, you know the neuromuscular junction, right? Voltage-gated calcium channels in the terminals are going to open up. Calcium comes in. That's going to start a biochemical cascade that causes vesicles containing acetylcholine to fuse with the membrane. When that happens, acetylcholine is released. It's going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft, bind to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Those are going to open up then. Sodium's going to rush in and depolarize my muscle fiber, the sarcolemma. When the sarcolemma is depolarized, right, that's going to lead to calcium release from my sarcoplasmic reticulum, and now we're into the sliding filament. Again, from what I just said, I hope you can understand too why I make this course cumulative. To understand this, you really need to understand all of what I just said. I hope much of that is review. Some of it may not be, but make sure you could say what I just said for the final exam. All right, so that's the basic circuit. Now this interneuron, again, is going to give me opportunity for modulation. It's not shown here, but my brain is going to send signals to that neuron that make it more or less excitable. So let's say I make my interneuron less excitable. I feel something, this neuron's trying to tell me, right? But since this guy is basically asleep, that information isn't going to get carried, and I'm going to be able to inhibit the generation of messages from this motor neuron to this skeletal muscle that will cause movement. Okay? Likewise, I can do the opposite. Sometimes we get excitation. So if you're nervous, you watched a scary movie, and now someone walks up and goes, "Boo!" You are going to jump through the roof. Right? And part of that, again, excitatory signals from the brain are going to increase the excitability of that startle reflex arc. All right. For logistical reasons, I need to take a short break. I'll come back and talk a little bit about the anatomy of this.